Are we waiting for me? Oh, I'm so sorry. I was waiting for you. I'm sorry, we would have been here all night.
First Darnell, and then you. Now we're ready.
Okay. I beg your pardon. I'm Cynthia Schneider, professor of diplomacy at Georgetown University, and do various other cultural diplomacy activities, including being on this board. And I think rather than going through each person, I'm going to, for the first time you speak on the panel, I'm going to, we'll go very quickly through each person just so you know who's who. But as I understand it, the point of this is that you guys are all talking, so I'm not going to actually let these people up here talk very much even. But just so you know who's who in case you haven't been able to be here the whole time. Beginning with Andras Simonyi, who is a rock musician who sometimes dabbles in politics and is a great both theoretician and practitioner of cultural diplomacy. Cassandra Sciortino, is that right? So we have two art historians on this panel, which I love. I'm the other one. I was actually an art historian, rare art historian, I think, who's able to bring it into diplomacy. That is a rare thing. I have a former life as an art historian, too. And Marcos, I'm so sorry, I don't have your last name here, Marcos. Kounalakis, yeah, I had that right on the tip of my tongue, who is a former journalist, covered a huge number of things from government to the private sector, and now is devising an ingenious system for measuring the impact and value of cultural diplomacy, which we all need, so people will listen to us more. The Honorable Erna Hennicot, former Minister of Culture and Religious Affairs of Luxembourg. Professor Nicholas Cull, who leads the public diplomacy program, the master's program at USC, which is the first place in the world, right, to have a public diplomacy program? Master's program, yeah, it's really established it as a major place. The Honorable Yasar Yakis, a former foreign minister of Turkey. The Honorable Dr. Nazar al-Batarna, former foreign minister of Bahrain, and now affiliated with Georgetown University and the Brookings Institution, two organizations that I'm affiliated with, but of course had to come here to meet you, so that's a great pleasure. And William Gaillard, the Director of Communications and Senior Advisor to the President of the, can I say UFA? UFA? Okay. Who just gave a great talk on sports diplomacy. I think what we'd like to do in this session is try to tease out some of the different ways that cultural diplomacy works in different sectors. Cultural diplomacy as either an arm of the actual government, cultural diplomacy as an arm of something that is a one step removed from the government, something like the British Council or the Maison Française. Cultural diplomacy in the private sector, which is something we haven't talked about so much, so I hope we'll bring that out. And also, I'm going to actually begin with something that falls into none of those categories, but I think it's very topical. And that is cultural diplomacy, the impact that cultural diplomacy can have from any individual action. I want to at first throw out there and see if others of you have examples or responses, the concept of cultural diplomacy as the vehicle that can bring things to light, whether it is abuses or extraordinary acts of courage that have a tremendous impact, that otherwise would be unnoticed. Now, the prime example of this, and the reason I'm saying this right now, is that one of the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Leymah Gbowee, would never in a million years be receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, although she very richly deserves it, were it not for the documentary film made about the women of Liberia who staged peaceful protests. Leymah is just a very ordinary person, staged peaceful protests and eventually brought the warlords and the government of Charles Table to the negotiating table, and then literally imprisoned them where they were negotiating until they would come out with a treaty. So she and a group of women faced down the most violent, really terrifying people you can imagine, and through peaceful protest, literally stopped the civil war in Liberia. But no one knew a thing about this until Abigail Disney and Ginny Redeker made the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And not only did they make the film, but they also then took that film all around the world to many other conflict zones and many other places where women in particular were repressed in one way or another, and showed the film, and in a classic cultural diplomacy experience, showed the film, and the way Abby described it was that the room first would go along with them with great empathy, and then the next step is they would say, okay, what do we do with that? And then form an action for how they were going to use this method for their own situation. There's another example of this with another film, the film Boudras, about the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and a talk about that by the filmmaker, Julia Basha, has just been selected as one of the top TED Talks of 2011, so you can go home and Google that on TED and see her film. But what I want to look at is the broader issue, and I wonder if others have examples, this can also involve the media, of things that are going on, very, very important things, but because the media, the governments, whoever, don't think they're so important, it's as if they don't exist. I mean, the continuing conflict in Bahrain is one example. How many people know that that's continuing? And we don't see it anymore because it's not covered anymore. So I wonder if there are any other examples or any responses of instances where some form of culture created by whatever actor has brought things to the surface, or even, we might say in the case of Bahrain, the absence of media attention, or media attention just in the social media maybe, which is not being picked up by the mainline media, leads to that being completely unnoticed. So I wonder if anyone has any comments on that, including among the audience. Would you like to? Can we have the? Oh, you've got one. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I think this is a very important point you raised. If we look at what's happening in the, I'm talking about now the MENA region in particular, the Arab Spring, the main thing that's stirring these people, okay, there is a problem of unemployment, there's a problem of corruption, but the major part is that people, they have a voice and they want the government to hear their voice. They need their dignity to be protected, and they need to get involved. Now, if we look at the famous 7 words which said by Ben Ali before he left, now I understand you. First of all, he said, I understand you. Then he said, now I understand you. Now, it took him 30 years to understand the people, his own people. So there is a gap between the government and the people there. And if you look at, of course, the other two, Mubarak and Gaddafi, they didn't say, I understand you. But eventually, they didn't understand the people. So it is very important to bridge this gap, is to have, as you suggested, probably in the government, to have an entity that look at cultural diplomacy between the government and the people in order to avoid what's going to happen later on. And I think that has to be not through under the one of the ministries, but it has to be a separate entity that will be empowered to do that work. There is, maybe it is trivial, but there is a big gap in the Arab world between the government and the people. And unfortunately, that's not covered in the media and not covered in any way, because what we see is only a reflection of that. And rather than we go just by the reflection, it is very important that we try to understand the people. The majority, the major factor there, the majority of the Arab world are youngsters. Over 33% are below the age of 25. And if we look at that, those people, they need somebody to sit and listen to them. And I think I stopped there.
Marcos, let me just sum up. So you're saying that the idea that cultural diplomacy, and when it exists for the government, needs to be in some kind of arm's length from the government, because it shouldn't be beholden to pursuing the government's policies, but also that it could even be a kind of conduit from a government to its own people as well as to the outside world. Is that correct? Okay.
Well, to stay in the region, I was going to touch on a movement.
Maybe make it a little closer to you somehow. No, there we go.
Okay. So to take off on what we were just saying, I think we could look to a single act and how it's affected the West. In fact, how the West has learned from some of the acts in North Africa. How the West has learned from a single act of disobedience and self-immolation in North Africa that grew to a movement of protest in North Africa, which eventually became a movement of indignation in Europe, which now can be defined as the movement of Occupy, whether it be Wall Street in the West. We clearly have a movement, as we were talking about earlier, from areas that we have now taken as an input in the West that began in the Arab world.
Sure. Let's go, Cassandra, go ahead.
To add to both of these comments, which were providing very specific examples, I think it's extremely important that if we are to have an organization, that a third-party organization that tracks these new movements, one place to start is to have an analyst or an analysis of new social media. Because the images, symbols travel very quickly and they cross boundaries that are conventionally divisive. So using tools like Facebook, like YouTube, even like Twitter, and to really keep track and even gather the data and organize it. And actually, as far as I know, there is no resource that actually continuously absorbs and gathers this data and keeps track of it and what the trends are. And it's moving quite quickly, and so.
Yeah, there we go.
Thank you very much. I'm more inclined to believe that the strengthening of the civil society organizations will yield better and concrete results rather than entrusting this task to a government body. If the government were eager to know what is the inclination of the people and what should be done with the people, or listen to them, they would do it without creating a new mechanism, a new ministry. And if it is going to be done by a government-appointed body, so they would report to the government the way the government will be pleased to hear, rather than what the people think. For this reason, strengthening the civil society will be perhaps a better solution to reflect both domestically and also abroad, because the civil society will get in touch immediately with their counterparts in foreign countries, will be fed by them, and this cultural interaction with them on the professional basis, also universities with the universities of other countries, trade unions with the trade unions of other countries, scientists, dancers, and as it was demonstrated by a distinguished participant this afternoon. So it is more to be left to agents which is beyond the government control, to the society itself. This is my perception.
Well, and that's a system. Did you want to add something? That's a system that is in operation in all the European countries that have cultural bureaus. And we used to have that in the United States with the United States Information Agency. Sort of, yeah, I guess not.
Never
Kind of,
sufficiently.
never sufficiently. So, but you are the expert on this, Nick. What's your thought?
Well, I feel as as Mark has argued in the past, that the effectiveness of cultural diplomacy declines in proximity, in proportion to its proximity to political advocacy. And I think that embedding your cultural diplomacy within a foreign ministry is a kind of insanity. And it is the least credible thing you could do is to surround your cultural diplomacy with the leaden hand of bureaucracy. And there is a reason why Europe has independent, arm's-length institutes of culture. And even the French are now, for France to say we're adopting a British Council model is an astonishing testament to how effective what Britain has done, what Germany's done with the Goethe Institute, and how this is a model that we should take very seriously. And it's become possible, or it is possible for these institutes of culture, these arm's-length institutes of culture, to operate in places where governments cannot operate, and to talk to people to whom governments cannot talk, not only in a foreign country, but also at home, where artists are prepared to work with a National Institute of Culture who would not be caught dead working for a politically charged foreign ministry. But there's a question,
Go ahead.
a comment behind.
Did you have a question? Yeah. Please introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind. And I'm afraid you back here, I don't know why you're here, but anyway, just, tap me on the shoulder or something if somebody wants to say something. I'm so sorry to have my back to you. That seems very rude. I apologize.
My name is Amy. My name's Amy. I'm from England. And I just wanted to make a comment on what Nick was saying here. And it seems to be sort of a consensus that's been made throughout the day that we want to try and encourage our cultural diplomacy initiatives to move away from government. And I just wondered how nation branding fits into that, because it's often quoted as such a tangible arm of cultural diplomacy, yet it's often always sort of driven by state. So I just wondered what you would make of that.
I mean, we'll maybe both answer that. I would never associate nation branding with cultural diplomacy. I would associate nation branding with public relations. And believe me, it's so much, the price tag is comparable to the price tag of public relations. And that's what it is. It's good to be conscious of what your country stands for, but it is basically, public relations. It doesn't have to do with the way you interact with other people and any kind of exchange. So I think it's actually very unrelated to cultural diplomacy.
Well, the nuance is that within the theory of nation branding, one of the things that a country brands and offers to the world is its culture. That's one arm of the brand in any country is its culture. So for some countries, in their branding process, choose to emphasize their culture, and therefore it has been a way in which National Institutes of Culture have got resource, is as part of nation branding strategies. So it has had that consequence of making resource available to organizations like the British Council, with something like the Think Britain campaign that Britain did in China quite effectively immediately after 2001, 2002, about then. So they are related. Whether they should be related, whether it is helpful to cultural diplomacy to have them related, is a whole other
good
question.
point on the revenue stream. But I would then come back to what the example you gave, which is such a great example of the British Council's productions of The Great Game and Blackwatch in Washington. They were so effective because these two plays were, in fact, quite critical of what the British had done in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. And for an American, obviously we're engaged in both of those places, to have it be a British theater company that is coming to Washington to critically examine this.
But we have a
and
brand.
no Americans were doing it.
But our brand is that we're allowed to talk back to our government.
Yes.
So we have a brand of
We have
culture
to call it a
speaking
brand.
truth to power.
Okay.
So
Touché.
that is all part. But the problem is British public diplomacy under Tony Blair and under Gordon Brown took a decision that it was not going to be about nation branding. It was going to be about contributing to the problems with cultural diplomacy that we thought were important in the world. So climate change was on the agenda, so counterterrorism, counter-radicalism was on the agenda, and promoting the idea of a knowledge economy was on the agenda. That is now being rolled back, and branding in Britain is back in a negative way with just a campaign, oh, Britain's great, and I think that is a step backwards, and so I'm not happy to see the sorts of things that you're talking about, which I was very, very impressed by as well. That isn't necessarily what the future of the present government's public diplomacy agenda, or I would say the present Prime Minister's agenda. The Foreign Office is still trying to, and the British Council are still trying to do what they were doing, but the Prime Minister's Office are pushing into a much more of a old-style nation brand.
Did you have a comment on that? And please, if other people have thoughts on this, you may want to contradict us with what we're saying about branding or have other thoughts about it, please raise your hands. Yeah.
But I do not agree that culture must be nation building.
Oh, no, it doesn't have to be, but it's part of it.
Culture is trying in Europe to transgress the borders, to be universal, and the Frenchman, he knows good as well as the German knows Voltaire, and so it's a trans-border. And that's for cultural diplomacy, the goal to achieve. How can we reach cultural diplomacy trans-border? And therefore we cannot fix it to governments as they are inside the borders. Cultural diplomacy has to be free, has to be a free movement that is awakening populations. Now revolutions are being made and populations are in the streets, but in our Europe, the revolution has been made 60 years ago, and the people are quiet and sitting before television and not bothering about what is happening. And for Europe, for the 27 of Europe, the challenge is to awake the public opinion and to create a space of debate for truly European public opinion. All the debate in Europe, they are national. They are linked to national politics, and they are not European. And there we have to achieve a very big goal.
Well, this is, of course, a very current issue, and I wonder if anyone here from Europe has any thoughts on this, or even Turkey, which is not in Europe, but very much part of all these debates. The idea that there's always been a goal, as I understand it, with the European Union of finding a common culture, and there was always that tension between the individual national cultures and the culture of the whole. And I think it, depending on how effectively that is practiced, seems to me to depend an awful lot on the individual. I was just at the home of the ambassador of the EU to Egypt, and he, I think, doesn't worry too much about whether or not he's representing. He's going to be coming to speak here in January, which is brilliant because he's a brilliant diplomat. Whether he's representing all of Europe as whether he is really understanding Egypt, and to what degree is he penetrating that country in the way I kind of mentioned earlier, trying to understand it through the voices of the people. And he, in fact, does that so effectively that when I was there in Egypt over the last 5 days, I was told by Egyptian after Egyptian that they go to him to find out what's going on in their country. Because he talks, another example I'd say put out there of best practice in cultural diplomacy, which they do, it's very much of a team, his wife's very active too, is mix people of all layers of society. And that's something you can do in the context of cultural diplomacy. When I was there, they just had a photo competition and they were having the opening of it. You can imagine the photos of the last year in Egypt, they were really incredible. And they had everyone from, very distinguished aristocratic Egyptians to young graffiti artists there. And they said, their guests said to them, this is the one place I can go that mixes society. So I think that's something and that's a purely government position. That is a totally diplomatic position. But you can sometimes go counterintuitively and use those government positions to kind of push the envelope and go outside the norm, which somehow, when you're doing that inside a government, that makes it even that more impressive, because it's so surprising to people. So beyond the typical.
May I say something on
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
topic? Regarding the diplomatic representation of the European Union, of course, there are certain constraints. After all, the diplomats who represent the European Union are on loan by their respective government to the European Union, and perhaps after having served as a representative of the European, they will go back to their own country's diplomatic service. This may constrain their freedom of action. They will look at the developments in the country where they represent the European Union with the spectacles, with the looking glasses of their own diplomatic representation. Whether you say that, but it is they represent not their country, their own country, but the European Union. If ultimately that person has to make the remainder of his career in his home country, then he cannot look Europe-wide to the developments in these countries. So what you said regarding the culture did not yet transcend the border. There is no European culture which will be represented by the representative of the European Union. Even if there was a culture, then you need, in addition to this, European diplomats whose relations, connections with their respective foreign minister should be cut forever, and that person should belong to the European Union, not to individual countries. This could be a solution. Yeah.
I think we should have a shift to what happened in environment policies in Europe. From a certain stage in the late 80s, environment policies became overall, there has to be looked first at environment for each decision. But there was a very strong public opinion, and there was a movement like Greenpeace asking and demonstrating and making big actions to have it through. And now it's a second way to do politics. When a street is built, the first question is what is happening to environment. And this should happen for culture as well. But it does not. It does not. We are taking decisions, we are opening to Croatia. Nobody is asking what is the culture in this country and what will be the change when Croatia joins the Union. So that is a big question to be dealt with.
I will just bring up, just before you just answer that and then you ask a question, a meeting I remember now over 10 years ago in the Netherlands talking about integration within the European Union and how this was going to be achieved. And they asked the Minister of Integration to speak, and he gave the most boring, uninspiring, imperceptive talk. It was unbelievable. Sort of, well, this person in this office is going to move here, and this is going to be reporting to this, and this is going to be reporting to that. And someone in the audience raised their hand. It was amazing because I had the American Secretary of Education visiting me at that moment. Somebody in the audience raised their hand and said, "What are you going to do about the teaching of history? You have to change the way history is taught, and we have to re-examine the way history is taught." This brilliant minister said, "Oh, you know what, this is an irrelevant question," and went on to talking about who was reporting to who. And there was almost a riot in the audience. person after person raised their hand and said, no, answer the question about history, which this person was totally incapable of answering. But it was just so interesting that of course, it does go back to history. And, and so any country in conflict, I'm sure you have examples of this. How do you teach the history? It's critical in the Balkans, which is unfortunately unchanged. They're still teaching separate history. So, this is, when you have this unified culture, you go back and you go back and you go back. But you go ahead, you had a question.
My name is Anela Sinanovic, I come from Slovenia. Well, what I was thinking during this conference is we have all this cultural diplomacy. We have so many experts. We have so many people who are trying to break these borders, and on the other hand, we have digital world. So what I'm trying to ask is, how does digital world impact the cultural diplomacy? And if in this digital world the boundaries does not exist, what can we expect in the future? What kind of a development of cultural diplomacy can we expect?
Who would like to take that on? Andras, you want to take that on? And also, I encourage people here, if you have thoughts on that question, on the digital question. Let me know. Go ahead, Andras.
At this moment, I just want to draw the attention to the fact that there is a great danger that Europe is sliding, individual European countries are sliding back towards nationalism. Mm-hmm. So let's not be too optimistic about how far we are. On the other hand, I don't think we have an alternative. So the bottom line is, sooner or later, integration will have to reach the depth so that the whole issue of the common European identity will not be an issue. And by the way, I'm a great supporter of Turkish membership in the European Union. Yeah, you can clap. Okay. But to answer your question, the problem with the internet, that it's very deceptive. It's misleading us. We actually think that the world has become more integrated culturally than it is, because we think that just because we can break down distances, thousands and thousands of kilometers, by the click of a mouse, we don't understand that we have not even moved this much in terms of integrating our minds culturally. And frankly, a Hungarian today is not closer to an Indian or a Ukrainian, by the way, than it was 20 years ago when there was no internet. So I just want to say that the internet is not going to do wonders unless we really want it to do wonders. And here there are lessons to be learned from the recent developments, how far the internet and how far new technologies with the right attitude, with the right demand, with the right desire of people have brought us in North Africa, Egypt, and elsewhere. But I'm kind of on the more pessimistic side. Now, I didn't want to join the debate. It was a very good discussion on state, non-state. But let's not. I think we're a little confused about who does what. I think there is a role to play by the state. I think the state can be very useful. I remember in the 70s and the 80s when the U.S. Embassy in Budapest played an incredibly important role. Let's not just discard that. While at the same time, civil society also played a very important role. And I don't think that has changed totally. The question is, really, and I think that's the real question. Has government bureaucracy, has politics kept is in lockstep with civil society, which has moved much faster, which has a much greater impact? And there, my answer is no. I think governments are the ones who are actually fighting the last fighting the new wars with the well, what's the way we formulate this with the technologies and the methods of the last war, and that's really where I think we have to be smart. By the way, I still do believe that the independence and the way the Brits have been in doing this for a very long time now stands out as a great example, which I hope sooner or later my country will follow.
Yeah, me too. Mark wanted to speak, and I know someone here does also, so please add your comment, Mark.
Just briefly, I want to ask a question, but maybe not for the panelists, but also for the participants. We really do want to make this as interactive as possible. Coming back to one of the questions we touched on before, due to the importance of cultural diplomacy, should we push for separate state ministries for cultural diplomacy? And I want to clarify something you were quoting Professor Cull. I am not of the opinion that governments should do less with cultural diplomacy, rather the opposite. I think governments should do more with cultural diplomacy. The question is what they should do and how they should do it. I think if it's in the classical sense of, as you're saying, nation branding, propaganda, persuasion, I don't think that's going to be helpful to the interdependent situation we're in. But if the government's role, or let's say there were to be a new ministry of cultural diplomacy, were to be to facilitate access, to allow different groups, different peoples to come together in the spirit of exchange, programs like Erasmus, academic exchange, etc., then I say there's no limits. I think governments can spend as much as they want, and they should. So I think there, just to clarify, I think governments actually should be doing more than they're doing now in partnership with civil society and also the private sector.
But shouldn't the government provision be insulated from the rest of that?
No, of course, yeah. So there, again, just briefly, and then again, I'd love to get also the perspectives of everyone else here. I think if the government sees their role as providing access, I mentioned earlier the model of the German universities, where the German government takes taxpayers' euros to provide access, so that more or less every German citizen has access to study. But the citizens themselves choose the universities, they choose what they study, etc. So that kind of a model, let's say if there were this Ministry of Cultural Diplomacy, really with that goal in the model just to actually provide access to what citizens want. The citizens decide what they do with that access. That could be interesting. And I think there I wouldn't be afraid of having big ministries with big budgets. Let's take some of the defense budgets maybe and move some of that money. There's a big potential. So, all right, well, hard power obviously won't disappear, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And then again, let's encourage more and more participants to pose questions and comments. We really do want to. We purposely put the camera in the middle so that we can really go around and actually encourage as much. I see one hand here, also Professor Sapovic, but Cynthia, you're keeping track. I think next is on the stage. Yep. So please.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm from the UK. This one? My question I'd like to pose to the panel, we're talking a lot about, a bit of Mark's comment, but talking a lot about technology, and I'm wondering what role technology and the internet has in terms of globalization and in terms of how we think of almost a homogenization of culture, because I think we've talked very positively so far, but about the role that the internet can have, but in terms of how globalization and the spread of Western culture can affect minority cultures and also, well, non-minority but non-Western cultures, perhaps in a negative light, and whether there's something we can do to combat that.
Do people want to answer that? Did you want to speak to that? I'm happy to. Also, anyone in the audience, the idea of the internet possibly drowning local culture.
I think regarding the technology, this is a very important factor. I think there are four major impacts or factors that's going to affect the world, or actually affecting the world. The first one is the emerging of new economies like China, India, Brazil, with a new culture, a new way of looking at things. The second one is the energy prices. There will be no cheap energy. Energy prices will go up, and definitely that will affect. The third one is that we have more younger population in the emerging economies than what we know. The fourth one is the technology. If you know that the number of users of internet in China is more than the population of the whole European Union. Now, those people need to be addressed, and those people need to be interacted with. So I think technology is very important, and we should not just say that it is. I look at what's happening even in Bahrain and in other places. What I learn about what's happening today, I learn more by going to Twitter and finding out what's happening than what I knew much more by reading some newspapers or others. So I think to answer these questions, definitely we need to look at technology, and we need to address how can culture diplomacy be interacted with technology or using in technology so that we can understand or reach to other people.
And is there someone with a question over here? No. Oh.
To your first question, who might be to mention institutions that might help support cultural diplomacy, I could add those countries who are having scholarships agencies like Humboldt Stiftung, DAD in Germany, like Fulbright, and some other in America, in the States. They are very important for cultural diplomacy. Questionnaire here might be interesting to see how many of these young people here now are part of one of the scholarship from the world. There is a suggestion that this panel will speak about new actors, new initiatives, and new targets. I would dare to mention something what has been mentioned now by a colleague from Bahrain. A new actor in the world and the world of politics and diplomacy is China, and India was mentioned. They are ancient China. They had diplomacy from before the war, before Europe, but they are now growing to the giant, to the another superpower, and we have to react on this, think about it, especially in regard to the human rights. Human rights are not observed in China. They are making good computers, or fairly good, but not quite good governing the state with the people and so on. New initiatives should not be forgiven that this institution, ICD, we are sitting in, had one fine initiative. It is Model Convention on Regional Rapid Reaction to Genocide, suggesting one important thing for cultural diplomacy: prevention, to prevent, to have early warning system so that we can act, the states, the international community could act. What is taking place now in Syria is serious, very much so. Maybe 20,000 people have been killed in the last couple of months. It shouldn't be like that. World, including cultural diplomats or diplomats and diplomacy, should react to this. Russia doesn't want it. China is reluctant. United States maybe have interest for Israel. Definitely they have it. And Syria is less dangerous as it is now than what might be tomorrow. So we have rather complicated situation. I would like to have some of your reactions to some of these statements. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's hear, from some of the younger people here on maybe on this topic related to Syria or not. You probably are is somebody back in here trying to talk? Okay, well, wake up everybody. Well, I mean, you hear constantly, that the internet is this, the internet is that. I just put out there, I'll just play the devil's advocate. The internet is just people. It's just the people behind it. On January 28th, the day that the largest number of people came out in Tahrir Square, there was no internet. And the phones were cut. How do you explain that? So do you all agree that, the internet is shaping everything? There was just an article about how people are dropping off Facebook. I mean, like 3, but anyway, so they managed to find some people who were dropping off Facebook at the time of they're about to have their public offering. But I'm curious.
Just dropped off Twitter.
Oh my gosh.
So you put him off.
He heard. Someone tweeted to you they were insulting you in Berlin. That was it. That was the end. I should be more careful. But I would love to hear from some of you. How do you respond when people say, oh, the internet, the internet? Are you tired of hearing it? Do you agree, or are we all just not getting it? Okay, let's hear.
Who's first? There, over here. I'd also like to just take the moment to acknowledge the presence of 2 special guests who've just arrived. President Recep Mediani, former president of Albania. If we could give a brief welcome for him also. And then just next to him, Lord Jack McConnell, the former First Minister of Scotland. Welcome also to Lord Jack McConnell. Thank you.
I'm Elina Melkin from Finland, and Finland is known for its digital tools and activists. But I also want to refer this idea of using tools. It's just a tool of using. Like earlier, we have newspapers and later broadcasts. So digital media is a media. We need to have the subjects. And what are the subjects that make people do common things? It may sound old-fashioned that nation-level centralized body, we don't need that on the digital time, but who takes care of the strategical thinking for the country? So long we have nations, we will have common needs, and we need a foreign ministry, or can you say what other party or body could think holistically of the actions in the cultural diplomacy or cultural diplomacy area?
Yeah.
Who's next, Cynthia? You have a better eye?
No, here. Okay. Right here. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Tiffany from the U.S. Okay, I'm Tiffany from the United States, and I'm from Arkansas specifically. I've been doing a lot of research on the Arab Spring, and it's kind of something that's been very interesting to me. And in a book, Generation Freedom, Gigi Ibrahim, who has been very instrumental in a lot of the organization, actually doesn't like that it's being called a Facebook revolution or that it's being called a Twitter revolution, because she talks about it just being a tool, and that it is the people. And she specifically cited the fact that people came out into here when there wasn't internet, and it wasn't because of that. And so it's important to understand, I think, that it is the people behind the computer. It's not the computer. It just is an organization that allows people to come together, but if they don't go out in the streets and actually protest, that does nothing.
There's someone here. I'll come to you in 1 sec. Go ahead.
My name is Carol Strong, and I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas. Sorry? Oh, okay. My name is Carol Strong, and I'm a professor at the University of Arkansas at Monticello, and these are 2 of my students. And one of the things I wanted to say is I like your idea of the Fulbright and the Rotary. I was a Rotary scholar, and I went to Australia, and I think that maybe we should look at old initiatives using new tools, because the internet is a tool, and it is something that is important. But I know that when people see images, they don't always understand what they're seeing, because the Tea Party last year when we were here, the Europeans were freaking out about the Tea Party and thinking that they were going to take over the United States, and the Americans here were kind of laughing, saying, no, this is not something that's going to be all that serious, and it's shown that that's true. The Americans are looking at what's going on in Egypt right now, and a lot of times they don't understand. They see these people coming out and they see that violence is erupting, and they interpret this as a need for more stability, and they don't necessarily understand the images that they're seeing. And so I think that this interaction in this forum where people actually come together, where I bring my students to talk to people from Europe, to talk to people from the international community, is so much more important, because then you can actually interact with other people. So if the internet is used to bring people together, then I think it's something that's very important. But if it's actually used to where you're just looking at images you don't understand, I think it can actually create a lot more problems than we realize.
Did you want to speak? Can we have a microphone over here? Is someone going around with microphones, please? Do we have only one in the whole room? Oh, well, I guess so.
What I wanted to, sorry, my name's Arion, and I'm Greek, but I really don't know where I'm from. What I wanted to say was more about human rights in general, about the double standards in it. How can we take human rights, enforcing it seriously when there's an embargo on Cuba because it is communist and violating human rights, and yet we deal with China? How is it we can intervene in Libya, but yet allow Saudi Arabia and the UN Human Rights Commission? How do you expect people to really take things serious like that when so many double standards exist?
Just a footnote, when I was ambassador, Libya was the chair of the Human Rights Commission. The chair, and at that moment we were having the Lockerbie trial. And I'm not sure, I mean, I think that says something about, I'm sorry to say the UN more than anything else, but did you have a comment?
Oh, you know.
Or does anyone want to answer that? What are double standards I want to continue this train of thought. Double standards in human rights, if people have thoughts on that?
Okay. I'm Leana Merkanyan from Armenia, specialist for cross-cultural communication and business etiquette. So I was the director and coordinator of American Corner in Armenia, Yerevan, which is means of also communicating the American and Armenian culture, and not only Armenian, Azerbaijan, Georgian, Turkish, Russian, Ukraine cultures. Just it's kind of cross-cultural communication, but it's still not enough. I would like to, what's my suggestion is the countries like third world and backwater countries where people are hardly equal and where social inequality and migration are inherent. People have lack of resources to have this cultural diplomacy, and still they have lack of resources even to be involved in Europe. For instance, I hardly come here getting this Schengen visa to come here to be involved here, but a lot of people and a lot of young leaders, future actors, they can be involved and make very good programs and spread these programs within the students, provide them opportunities which we have still lack. I would like Europe to provide the opportunity to use the paradigm of cultural diplomacy of Europe in third world and countries, transmission countries like Armenia, because we are still having this lag, and very few students can hardly manage to get scholarship to, as it was mentioned there, the scholarships and other British Fulbright programs to be involved in European culture, but there are few, and after studying abroad, they don't want to go back and to work there. This is a huge problem which culminates migration, which in its turn culminates social inequality and calamitous consequences. I think that if people and government were cohesive and communicating with Europe, they can stand a positive step. Europe can stand a positive step to provide opportunity to use the paradigm of cultural diplomacy of Europe into this kind of countries like third world and transmission countries. Thank you.
So the importance of cultural diplomacy in conflict situations, of which there are many, many examples, is sometimes the only way that you can have two sides talking to each other, but particularly in developing countries as well.
We had another comment here I saw. I'm not sure you have a better vantage point. I think is Tatiana next? Or?
So to these tools and internet, I think it's very important to create tools where we can facing each other in the net and build networking. But interfaces are, I think, even more important, and such platforms which are embodiment of the idea of Joseph Ney or Milton Cumming or so many other people who marked cultural diplomacy as important. Mr. Donfried gave a weight to this word. We have space to share and to discuss about. I don't think it is really necessary to create spaces inside of governments, but platforms like this is, I think, a great opportunity. We are here people across the world, and I think we have really power, and we can exchange our logos or exchange inviting of each other lectures. So we are moving across transversal, and I think it is still important to come out of internet and also to meet each other, to share some gifts or poisons. So.
Yeah. There's a comment here.
Hello, I'm Maria. I'm coming from France. I have a question for all the people in the panel discussion. You are all talking about the concept of cultural diplomacy, and I have my own understanding of cultural diplomacy, but I would like to know if you all share the same definition of this concept, because everyone is using this concept, like saying cultural diplomacy, it can be used like this, but I would like to understand better what is your definition behind this concept. Thank you.
I'm going to ask, actually, Mr. Gaillard, why don't you answer that first from the perspective of sports? No one is expected to come up with a super precise definition, I think, and we're definitely not all going to provide definitions. We'll be here all night. I think it's it's not so bad if we all have different concepts of what it is. I think we're talking basically about understanding people better through the voice of the people and people-to-people communication, but we haven't had a chance to talk about sports yet, so I'd like to hear what you think about from there.
I believe, sports is a micro phenomenon. It affects individuals, and it can affect individuals across borders. And I believe the difference between the macro and the micro level in international relations is at the macro level, you've got governments, large corporations, groups that are powerful and institutionalized. At the micro level, you've got the influence of artists, thinkers, the man in the street, through internet, through Twitter, through Facebook, through personal letters. They still exist, at least emails. I think sports does the same. That is, it has the power to change society by changing individual attitudes. Without this heavy institutional control or influence. I think that's the difference. Culture seeps through the cracks, and government action or corporate action is something that is highly institutionalized with powerful means, and it goes over the surface. But culture seeps through the cracks. Something that happens, one individual confronting another one can have an influence in changing the life of people. I'll just give an example. Today, the English Football Association has a meeting of its disciplinary body to deal with an instance in which one player said something to another player that the other player felt was racist. This has led to a tremendous debate in the English press about what constitutes a racist insult, but also has led to a debate in the Uruguayan press, because one of the players is actually from Uruguay. And people try to understand, in the cultural context of Uruguay, whether what he had said was a racist insult or not. So you've got hundreds of thousands of people in both Britain and Uruguay who are deciding what is now appropriate in an exchange of opinion between two individuals, the kinds of adjectives that you can use and the kinds that you cannot. That's, I think, cultural diplomacy in many ways.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Fascinating example. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to answer several questions that was raised. First of all, about the definition of cultural diplomacy. That will be my speech tomorrow. So if you attend tomorrow, you will have maybe a better understanding, at least from my perspective. The second thing about the human rights and the double standard, I think nobody answered that. I think, unfortunately, human rights is not used as the word human rights. Sometimes used politically by certain countries to force other countries to do what they want to do. And they utilize the human rights as purpose. The problem is that the human rights, there is no real indicators in the measurement of the human rights. And again, you have to wait till I publish my book, hopefully before the end of the year, and how to create a human rights model which can fit any country, and also with indicators so that you can actually measure those, whether the country is actually doing the human rights in the right way or not. Thank you.
I would love to hear from Lord McConnell, who we haven't heard from yet, representing Scotland. I think it'd be interesting to hear about regional aspects of this as well. If you want to give the definition, it's okay too.
Well, not really a definition, more a state of
that.
mind, I would say. I mean, for me, cultural diplomacy could be defined in lots of individual ways in terms of the actions that one might pursue. But I think, for me, cultural diplomacy is about an attitude of mind. Most of the abuses of power that happen in the world, most of the conflicts that happen in the world happen because of fear. Fear of the other, fear of the unknown, fear of somebody else's culture, somebody else's identity. And you know, my interest in this area, and I think what is fantastic about these groupings of people from all over the world coming together to discuss these ideas, is the opportunity to reduce that fear, to have greater levels of understanding, and perhaps most importantly of all, to have a greater level of celebration of diversity. Because it's only through the celebration of diversity and the understanding of other cultures that we will truly move forward and have diplomacy being more significant in our world than conflict. And so for me, cultural diplomacy is about an attitude of mind. It's about wanting to understand, know more about, and celebrate other cultures, other identities, other ways of thinking. Even within my own culture and identity, understand other ways of thinking. And if we are able to promote that attitude of mind, then we will have done significantly more than the bullet or the gun will ever do.
Did you have a comment over there? And just while it's being passed on the fear of the other, I just have to mention something that I encourage all of you to Google tonight. It is so hilarious. The two Daily Show, Jon Stewart episodes on something that is taking place in the United States right now. There is a new reality program called the All American Muslim Family, and it's a reality show of just some Muslim families, Muslim American families living in Detroit. And it's now the advertising has been withdrawn, and the person representing the group that forced the advertisers but intimidated the advertisings into withdrawing. His complaint is that this program, which is most of all really boring because it's just normal people leading normal lives, which is the point, his complaint is this is pernicious because it does not follow the negative stereotypes that he has about Muslim Americans. So, and I mean, it's just beyond belief. And Jon Stewart does a wonderful job of parodying this. It's really, really great. I encourage you to Google it when you get home tonight. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Beert Beukenhorst from Amsterdam. I completely agree with your comments on fear and that cultural diplomacy can play a role in battling fear or creating mutual understanding. Yet, at the same time, as you just mentioned also, nowadays in politics we also see a sort of a nationalistic backlash, maybe a populistic backlash as well. So I was wondering what your thoughts or other thoughts are also to sort of prevent cultural diplomacy from being an elitist endeavor where one elite audience is talking to another elite audience and everyone's agreeing on opera and art and everything else. And also touching the more what you could call populist sentiments or sort of, well, outside of the elites. Is there a role there? I think football would play a role, but maybe there are other options as well.
How do you prevent from being non-elite? You have a thought?
I just want to piggyback ever so quickly. Is this one working? This is working. All right, good. Yep.
Hi, I'm Neil Rosendorf. I'm an historian from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'll just ever so briefly say fear, absolutely a factor. But we should not forget good old-fashioned greed. That in the case of the Gaddafis, undoubtedly there was fear, say fear of ending up, sodomized and murdered and all that sort of thing if the ordinary people ever got in control of things. And in the case of Syria as well, there is undoubtedly fear operative amongst many ordinary, not so ordinary, say Alawites, Christians, and others. But there is an enormous amount of greed as well that is propelling so much of the bloodshed there. So I don't think that we want to, we don't want to downplay that aspect. And I'm not sure that there's any way in which cultural diplomacy, whether it's through the conduits of government or whether it's through any other conduits, are going to have any kind of positive impact on, sanguinary greed or greedy sanguinary practices.
Cultural diplomacy and greed. Any thoughts on that? Would you yeah.
Is this working? Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay. Just to sort of, first of all, kind of just comment on your comment about greed. And dovetail it with this question about how I define cultural diplomacy. I'm new to cultural diplomacy. It's a course that I've begun teaching and working on in a very short period of time. So I very much admire what you said about it being a state of mind, but I am concerned that could just lapse into a general observation of the world is getting to know itself better. That we need to tie, in my mind, cultural diplomacy with goals toward a policy or goals towards the dissemination of information that leads to a deeper understanding of different nations, different cultures, and so on. The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is a forum. This is cultural diplomacy because it's promoting knowledge and information. To go to the question of the internet, I absolutely agree with what you said. It's not a panacea. It's not going to solve the world's problems. It's not a solution that can be focused on. However, I wouldn't be here without the internet. And the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy's website is a gold mine for my students. I had my students go in and analyze some of the case studies. One article that's posted for free, that's another issue of the internet. It doesn't cost money for me to get photocopies made or even to buy a book, is on the idea of what soft power constitutes, which brings me back to the original question of greed. This particular author talked about soft power being composed of beauty, brilliance, and benignity. And these are powers of attraction. Now, I think it's self-evident beauty, okay, Bolshoi ballet supposedly. Brilliance, the Olympics, or a spectacular sports figure doing something remarkable. Benignity is the value, increasing value of the idea of doing gestures of kindness or selfless behavior that leads to social rewards or social appreciation. So there is a possibility that within this kind of dim mind of greed, if there's a sense of being socially important by a gesture towards something that receives positive feedback on the international scale, then that might be a little dent in it. So that's
very interesting. Very, very. Did you want to add something, Marcos? And
Sure.
we have one behind here.
The technology question keeps coming up, and I had the good fortune of spending a fair amount of time in the Silicon Valley, so I'll just make a couple of points. One is, the question is, what does it do? We all agree it seems that it's really just a tool, but what does this tool actually do? Well, one thing it does is it accelerates. It clearly has sped up both communications, networking, all and things of that like. That's why when Professor Cull's father, or was it, he was a sea captain, he can now find, is that right? Uncle had friends when he'd run into a sea captain, which couldn't have been that often unless he was in ports. He can now actually get online and actually find a tribal community, a global tribe of sea captains, and be constantly connected to this organization. So the second thing it does is it networks very easily. It allows you to network very easily. But as was made by the colleague next to me, the price of entry is absolutely diminished, which allows us then to know what's going on in Syria. Because I guarantee you, were it a decade ago and the exact same instances were occurring, there would be no way to get the type of images that we're currently getting out of Syria, for us to be as concerned as we are about Syria on a broader scale than we would be than we would have been then. It's just absolutely been the lubricant to information, because it is friction-free for the most part, to allow us to achieve that without intervention. So price of entry is lowered. There's no intermediation in this regard. And of course, the attendant negatives that are possible, because these positive sides also have a very dark side. They have the dark side of control, which is very real. It certainly has been real in Iran, for example, where people who use the types of technologies try to get out can be easily found. It has the dark side of disinformation. It has the dark side of propagandistic events being propagated because there's no way to check them, because some of the other instances of being unable to confront these information sources exist. So we shouldn't, the idea of it being a panacea has been brought up and confronted, but I think we have to clearly look at the very specific areas in which it has changed it and how it has changed it, and they're multiplicitous. They're just across the board, and they are both positive but also negative.